Welcome to our deep dive into the future of fabric. So get this, what we wear could actually, I think, become like a force for good for the planet. Pretty cool, right? We're diving into some seriously cool sources. Interviews with designers who are like pushing the boundaries, articles on the latest and greatest materials, and even some of the science behind it all.
Yeah, the fashion industry's environmental impact is huge. So the idea that we could turn things around and make our clothes like part of the solution, that's really exciting.
I know, right? We'll be exploring some pretty wild innovations today. Think fabrics made from algae and even human sweat. But first, let's talk about why we even need these new fabrics. Traditional materials like non-organic cotton and those petroleum-based nylons, they're kind of a problem.
Yeah, it's not just the fabrics themselves, it's the whole supply chain. Pesticides and cotton farming, tons of water being used, and all those microplastics ending up in our water when synthetic fabrics are washed. It all adds up to some serious environmental damage.
Okay, so we know the problem. Now for the fun part, the solutions. Let's kick things off with rose petals. Rose petal silk. Can you believe that's becoming a thing?
It's incredible. There's already peace silk, which is a cruelty-free alternative to regular silk. But this rose petal silk takes sustainability even further. It's made from the leftover petals from Indian rose bushes, and they even use natural pigments for dyeing. It's a great example of circularity in fashion, using something that would otherwise be wasted.
It's a win-win. Not only are they avoiding the ethical issues of traditional silk, but they're also finding a use for something that would normally be discarded. And get this, algae is another contender in the sustainable fabric game.
Algae is amazing. It's super efficient at absorbing CO2 while it grows, which means it's actually cleaning the air. And it's surprisingly versatile. We're seeing everything from weatherproof outerwear to super comfy underwear made from algae-based fabrics.
That's so cool. What's really fascinating to me is how designers are using algae. I was reading about Charlotte McCurdy, who created a weatherproof fabric by mixing powdered seaweed with algae fats and then buffing it with plant-based waxes. That's some next-level stuff.
It is, and it really highlights the possibilities here. Imagine a world where our clothes are not only stylish, but also actively fighting climate change. Talk about fashion with a purpose.
Okay, now get ready for this one, because it's definitely the most unique material we've come across. Sweat crystals. Designer Alice Potts is actually growing crystals from human sweat. I know, it sounds crazy.
It's definitely outside the box thinking, but that's what innovation is all about. Potts is really highlighting the ethical problems with mined crystals. Think about the labor conditions and the damage to the environment. By growing these human diamonds in a lab from sweat, she's found a completely renewable source.
And think about the possibilities. We could be wearing jewelry and clothing with crystals that literally came from us. It's a whole new level of personalization and sustainability. But it also makes you wonder, what other surprising things could end up in our wardrobes in the future?
Right. It makes you think about the possibilities of biomaterials in fashion. Speaking of plants, have you heard about what they're doing with pineapple leaves and leather?
Oh yeah, Pinyatex. I've seen that popping up everywhere. Brands like H&M and Paul Smith are even using it in their collections now. It's pretty cool that you can make a leather alternative from something like pineapple leaves.
It really is. Pinyatex is a great example of how we can create high-quality, durable materials from unexpected sources. The creator, Dr. Carmen Hicosa, was inspired to find an alternative to leather after seeing the negative impacts of its production. So not only is this a cool new material, but it's also a great story of someone taking action to make a difference.
It really is. Okay, so we've got rose petals, algae, sweat, and pineapple leaves. What other unexpected things could we be wearing in the future? What about cashmere? I mean, it's super cozy, but it's also got pretty hefty environmental impact.
You're right. Traditional cashmere production, especially in Mongolia, is linked to deforestation and overgrazing, which is definitely a concern. But here's the good news. Sustainable alternatives are starting to emerge. One that caught my eye is KD New York's plant-based cashmere, which is made from leftover soy protein from tofu production.
Whoa, so they're turning tofu scraps into cashmere? That's wild.
It is, and get this, the soy-based cashmere isn't just eco-friendly, it's also antibacterial, moth-resistant, and you can even throw it in the washing machine. That's a pretty serious game changer.
That's amazing. So what you're saying is that the future of fashion could be both sustainable and convenient. Sign me up.
It's definitely looking that way, but the big question is, how do we make these incredible innovations accessible to everyone?
Yeah, that's a good point. If we want to see real change in the fashion industry, it can't just be about niche high-end products. These sustainable options need to be available and affordable for everyone.
Absolutely. But it's not just about the price tag. We also need to make sure these materials can stand the test of time. There's no point in switching to eco-friendly options if they fall apart after a few washes.
That's true. So durability is key. But I'm also thinking about something you mentioned earlier, the ethical issues around some of these traditional materials. If we can find ways to create sustainable and ethical options that are also affordable and durable, that could be a real win for the fashion industry.
I agree, and I think that's where the real excitement lies. These innovations aren't just about swapping one material for another, they're about rethinking our entire relationship with clothing.
So what does this mean for the average person who just wants to find some cool clothes that don't cost a fortune and won't harm the planet?
It means there's hope. We're at a really interesting point in the evolution of fashion. We're seeing a shift toward more conscious consumption, more ethical production, and more innovative materials, and that's something we can all be a part of.
I love that. So it's not about feeling guilty about our love for fashion. It's about being empowered to make more informed choices.
Exactly. And speaking of choices, there's so much more to explore in the world of sustainable fabrics.
Okay, I'm ready for more. Let's dive into some of those details and see what else is out there.
It's fascinating to think about how much our relationship with clothes has changed over time. Like, for centuries, clothing was mostly about practicality and protection, but these days it's so much more than that.
Totally, our clothes are like an extension of ourselves, a way to express our individuality, creativity, and even our values. But as we become more aware of the environmental and social impacts of fashion, it feels like we're seeing a shift back towards a more mindful approach to clothing.
I think you're right. The slow fashion movement is all about emphasizing quality over quantity, timeless designs over fleeting trends, and ethical production practices instead of cheap labor and mass production.
And it's not just individual consumers making changes. Either brands and designers are also stepping up and taking responsibility for their impact on the environment and society.
Absolutely. We're seeing more and more brands that are committed to using sustainable materials, reducing their carbon footprint, and making sure their supply chains are ethical. These brands are proving that you can be stylish and sustainable at the same time.
It's really inspiring to see how creativity and innovation can be used to create a better future for fashion. But let's be real, there's still a long way to go. There are still so many complex issues that we need to address, like the overuse of water and pesticides and cotton farming and those mountains of clothes that end up in landfills every year.
And we can't forget about the social impact of the fashion industry. Either fast fashion often relies on a system that exploits garment workers, especially in developing countries. We need to make sure that everyone involved in making our clothes is treated fairly and paid a living wage.
It's a good reminder that sustainability isn't just about protecting the environment. It's also about social justice. We need a fashion industry that benefits everyone, from the farmers who grow the raw materials to the people who sew the clothes to the folks who wear them.
It's a complex system for sure, but I think change is definitely possible. We need to keep pushing for more transparency from brands, demand better regulations from governments, and make informed choices as consumers. Even small actions can contribute to a more sustainable and ethical fashion industry.
I love that perspective. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming to think about all the problems in the world, but it's good to remember that we can all make a difference. Our choices matter. And when it comes to fashion, we have so many opportunities to make a positive impact.
Exactly, from choosing sustainable fabrics to supporting ethical brands to simply wearing our clothes for longer, there are tons of ways to reduce our fashion footprint and contribute to a better future.
And speaking of reducing our footprint, let's go back to those innovative materials we were talking about earlier. I'm curious about the process of actually turning those unusual things into fabrics. Let's start with algae. How do you go from a slimy pond organism to a fabric you can wear?
It's a pretty cool process. Different companies use different techniques, but it basically involves harvesting the algae, drying it out, and then processing it into a fiber that can be spun into yarn. Some companies are even using algae to create bio-based dyes, so they don't need to use harsh chemicals.
It's amazing to think that something as simple as algae could be a key to a more sustainable fashion industry. And what about plant-based leather? I'm fascinated by the idea of using pineapple leaves or mushrooms to create a material that looks and feels like leather.
There are a bunch of different methods for creating plant-based leather, but they usually involve extracting fibers from the plant material, processing them, and then bonding them together to make a sheet that can be used just like traditional leather.
So it's not just about finding those alternative materials. It's also about coming up with innovative ways to process them and turn them into something that's both functional and stylish. What about soy-based cashmere? How do you go from soybeans to a super soft, luxurious sweater?
They extract protein from soybeans and spin it into fibers that mimic the feel and texture of real cashmere. It's a great example of biomimicry, which is where we use nature as inspiration for creating sustainable solutions.
Wow, that's incredible. It's so cool to see how science and technology are being used to create a better future for fashion. But it's important to remember that these innovations aren't a magic solution to everything. There are still some challenges and limitations that we need to address, right?
Definitely one of the biggest hurdles is scaling up production. Many of these materials are still being produced in relatively small quantities, which can make them pricier than conventional options. We need to figure out how to ramp up production and make these materials more affordable if we want them to become mainstream.
And we need to make sure that these new materials are truly sustainable throughout their entire life cycle, too. It's not enough to just swap one material for another. We need to think about the environmental impact of every step of the process, from getting the raw materials to the manufacturing process to what happens to the clothes when people are done with them.
That's such an important point. We need to look at sustainability from a holistic perspective, looking at the whole system, not just individual pieces. And we also need to watch out for greenwashing, where companies make misleading claims about how sustainable their products actually are.
Transparency is so important. Consumers need to be able to trust that the information they're getting from brands is accurate. And we need to hold brands accountable for their commitments to sustainability and ethical practices.
I couldn't agree more. We all have a role to play in creating a fashion industry that's more sustainable and ethical. It's a collaborative effort.
I love that it's not just about doing the right thing for the planet and for people. It's also about creating a more beautiful and inspiring future for fashion. I think sustainability can actually spark more creativity and innovation, leading to new designs, new materials, and new ways of thinking about clothes.
Absolutely. Sustainability isn't about limitations, it's about possibilities. It's about reimagining the way we create, consume, and experience fashion. And I think the future of fashion is going to be more sustainable, more ethical, and more beautiful than ever before.
That's a vision I could definitely get behind. But before we get carried away with all the possibilities, let's bring it back to the here and now. What are some practical things our listeners can do today to make their wardrobes more sustainable?
That's a great question. One of the simplest things we can all do is buy less stuff before you buy something new. Ask yourself if you really need it. Could you borrow it from a friend? Could you find it secondhand? Could you repair something you already own?
I love that it's all about being more thoughtful and intentional about our consumption habits. You don't need a closet bursting with clothes to express yourself or feel good about how you look.
Exactly. And if you do decide to buy something new, make sure it's something you really love and will wear for years to come. Choose quality over quantity and look for brands that are transparent about how they make their clothes and are committed to sustainability.
And don't forget about taking good care of your clothes, washing them less often, air drying them whenever possible, and learning how to fix small rips or tears can go a long way.
Those little things can make a big difference in extending the life of your clothes and reducing their environmental impact. And when you're finally ready to part ways with an item, think about donating it or selling it secondhand instead of tossing it in the trash.
It's about closing the loop and keeping clothes in circulation as long as possible. Sustainability isn't just about buying new things. It's about taking care of what we already have.
And don't underestimate the power of using your voice. We can advocate for change, challenge the status quo, and demand a more sustainable and ethical fashion industry, whether it's writing to your elected officials, sharing information on social media, or simply talking to friends and family. Our voices can make a difference.
It's a good reminder that we're not alone in this. There are so many people who are passionate about sustainable fashion, and together we can make a real difference. But let's not forget about the fun part of fashion. Sustainability doesn't have to be about deprivation or sacrifice.
Absolutely not. In fact, I think embracing sustainability can lead to even more creativity and personal style when we start thinking about where our clothes come from, the materials they're made of, and the people who made them. It adds a whole new layer of meaning and appreciation to our wardrobes.
And it can be fun to explore new sustainable brands, experiment with different styles, and find ways to repurpose and reinvent the clothes we already have.
I totally agree. Sustainability should be an invitation to be more playful and expressive with our fashion choices, not a restriction.
I love that perspective as we continue our deep dive into the future of fabrics. I'm feeling hopeful and excited. It seems like the fashion industry is at a turning point, and all of the innovations we've talked about show that a more sustainable and ethical future is possible.
I share your optimism. We've come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to do. We need to keep learning, keep trying new things, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in the world of fashion.
I'm right there with you. I can't wait to see what amazing new discoveries and creations will pop up in the years to come. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's pause here for a moment and think about everything we've learned so far.
Yes, let's take a moment to really absorb all of this incredible information. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the bigger implications of these innovations and how they could transform not just the fashion industry, but our whole relationship with clothing. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the future of fabrics. We've covered a lot of ground, from algae textiles to sweat crystals and plant-based leather. It's clear that there's a ton of innovation happening in sustainable fashion right now. But I'm curious, what does it all mean? Where is this all going?
Well, what's fascinating to me is how all of these individual innovations point towards a much bigger change that's happening. It's not just about finding new materials, it's about completely changing the way we think about clothes.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about what you mean by rethinking our relationship with clothing.
Well, for a long time now, we've treated clothing as something disposable. Wear it a few times and then toss it. But these new materials and technologies are challenging that idea. They're encouraging us to see our clothes as investments, something to value and take care of.
That's a big shift, and it goes back to that idea of slow fashion we talked about, moving away from chasing trends and being more mindful about what we wear.
Exactly. And it's not just about the environmental impact either. It's also about appreciating the craftsmanship and skill that goes into making clothes. When we choose well-made, sustainable pieces, we're supporting designers and artisans who are truly passionate about their work.
So it's about quality over quantity, durability over disposability, and it's about understanding the stories behind our clothes, who made them, what they're made of, and where they came from.
Yeah, and I think this shift could even change our personal style. When we start thinking of clothing as investment, we become more picky about what we buy. We choose pieces that really reflect who we are, and that will last for years to come.
Instead of being caught up in the latest trends, we're creating wardrobes that are timeless, versatile, and full of pieces that we truly love. That actually sounds really liberating. But let's be real. Not everyone can afford to buy high-end, sustainable clothes. How do we make this shift towards mindful consumption possible for everyone?
That's the big question, and it's going to take a multifaceted approach. We need brands to keep innovating and finding ways to make sustainable materials and production methods less expensive. We also need to educate consumers and make it easier for them to understand and choose sustainable options.
And we need to change how people think about secondhand clothing. There's still a stigma around pre-owned clothes that needs to be addressed.
Totally agree. Secondhand shops can be amazing places to find unique and stylish clothes. It's such a great way to reduce our environmental impact and support a circular economy.
And don't forget about getting creative. Upcycling, repurposing, and mending our clothes are fantastic ways to make them last longer and give them a new life.
Yeah, those are skills that used to be so common, but we've kind of lost them in our throwaway culture. It's time to bring those skills back and see the potential in transforming our existing wardrobes.
I love that idea. So where does all of this leave us? What does the future of fashion actually look like?
I think we're at the very beginning of a major change. We're moving away from fast fashion towards a system of slow fashion where quality, durability, and mindful consumption are valued.
It's not just about the clothes themselves. It's about the whole system, the materials, the production, the way we buy and care for our clothes.
Yeah, it's about looking at the environmental, social, and economic impacts of the fashion industry and making changes across the board. And I think we're going to see this movement continue to grow.
Well, after this deep dive into the future of fabrics, I'm feeling optimistic. It's clear that innovation is happening everywhere. Sustainable alternatives are becoming more common, and more people are demanding change.
It's a really exciting time to be involved in the fashion world, and I truly believe that the future of fashion is going to be brighter, more beautiful, and more sustainable than ever before.
That's a vision I can get behind. So we've reached the end of our deep dive into the future of fabrics. We hope you've enjoyed learning about all of these amazing innovations and that you're feeling inspired to rethink your own relationship with clothing.
Yeah, remember, every choice we make, no matter how small it seems, can have an impact. Let's all keep exploring, keep innovating, and keep pushing for a fashion industry that is both stylish and sustainable.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration into a world of knowledge.